In the final, gilded moments of the Great Crusade, the seeds of heresy were not always sown in the machinations of dark gods or the whispered treasons of the ambitious. Sometimes they were found in the clash of steel, in the philosophical divide between how a warrior believes he should win and what he is willing to do to ensure he does. This recovered document, designated a Remembrancer Tactical Archive, details one such portentous moment, a sparring match held upon the deck of the Vengeful Spirit. The record presents us with a stark dichotomy. On one side, martial pride, represented by a blade of exquisite artistry, its form perfect, its purpose elevated to an art. This is the philosophy of the flawless swordsman, the duelist who seeks perfection in the form of combat itself. On the other, pragmatism, a brutal, bloodied gauntlet, starkly rendered within the cold calculus of a targeting reticle. It represents the unadorned truth of war, that the only metric is victory, and the only art is its achievement. The record asks a question that is both tactical analysis and grim parable. Why was the galaxy's most flawless swordsman defeated by a single punch? This confrontation was not merely a contest of arms, but a clash of irreconcilable doctrines. The beautiful, ceremonial duel versus the ugly, decisive blow. In this single, pivotal moment, this microcosm of the coming war, we see the fatal crack that would sunder the Imperium. To understand this record is to understand the tragedy that was to follow. And so the very nature of conquest became a point of contention, not a debate held in councils or senates, but one waged in blood and fire across 1,000 systems. At the heart of this schism were two of the emperor's most favored sons and their legions. On one side of the scale, as this archival pictograph illustrates, we see the philosophy of the IIIrd Legion, the emperor's children. For them, war was an extension of art, driven by a ceaseless, agonizing pursuit of absolute perfection. Every battlefield was a canvas, every bolt round a brushstroke. Combat demanded not just victory, but grace, aesthetic superiority. They are symbolized by the flawless bust, a testament to an ideal of martial beauty. Weighed against them is the 16th Legion, the Luna Wolves. Their symbol, the anvil. For them, war was a brutal mathematical equation. They were driven by absolute efficiency, a cold calculus demanding only the swift neutralization of a threat. There was no art, only the overwhelming application of force. Two legions, both peerless instruments of the Great Crusade, forged to conquer the galaxy, yet separated by a fundamental, irreconcilable disagreement on the very purpose of war itself. Perfection versus efficiency, the artist versus the hammer. The scales of history rarely balance such opposing forces for long. This philosophical divide was more than a rivalry. It was a fault line running through the heart of the Imperium, waiting for the right tremor to shatter it all. And in the quiet moments between glories, one must ask, what happens when the pursuit of perfection finds no earthly limit, and the calculus of efficiency accepts any variable to achieve its solution? Perfection was not an abstract concept for the IIIrd Legion. It was a creed made manifest in the crucible of the duel, a truth sought at the edge of a blade. They saw themselves as superior, refined artists rather than blunt instruments of conquest. On gilded warships and captured worlds, they would spend countless hours in practice cages, mastering highly specific, regulated forms. This entire philosophy orbited a singular, massive force, the ego. It was an ego fed by pride in their unmatched skill, a fixation on the aesthetics of a perfect kill, and an obsession with the ever-increasing complexity of their martial styles. As Captain Saul Tarvitz of the Emperor's Children himself presciently noted, it is about purity, but one is often mistaken for the other. We can seem aloof and haughty. They had fallen for the lethal illusion of combat as performance. This was their grand blind spot. They treated war like a regulated sport, expecting their enemies to appreciate the sublime artistry of their own destruction. They were prepared for a contest. They were not prepared for a slaughter. And so, in the Emperor's Children, the pursuit of perfection became an art form in itself. The battlefield was a stage, war a canvas, and its greatest artist, its most flawless blade, was Captain Lucius. A duelist without peer, Lucius wielded a relic longsword forged by the Tarawat clan of the Urals during the bloody unification of Terra. His fighting style was a resurrection of those ancient days, a twin-blade mastery of dizzying wrist turns that was as beautiful as it was lethal. But it is here, in the cult of perfection, that the seeds of damnation are sown. The defining trait of Lucius was the hubris of the artist. During the extermination campaign against the megarachnids on the aptly named planet Murder, the captain saw not a war, but a performance. He treated the deadly cybernetic Xenos as mere sparring partners, using the carnage to invent a new sword twirl he intended to name the Lucius, wholly ignoring the slaughter of his own men around him. Such monumental self-regard cannot exist in a vacuum. A pride so vast, so all-consuming, becomes a beacon in the dark. It draws the attention of things that hunger for just such exquisite, perfected souls. For a legion already dedicated to sensation, a warrior like Lucius was not an aberration. He was a sign of things to come. For the Legiones Astartes, the calculus of war is stripped of all sentiment. It is a brutal three-act drama played out on 1,000 worlds, a simple, linear progression devoid of preamble or epilogue. Identify threat, apply necessary force. Threat eliminated. This is the catechism of violence that defines the Emperor's angels. A warrior of the legions is taught to view himself purely as a weapon, his mind scoured of the vanities of personal glory or ego. There is no interest in showing off, no room for martial pride. Failure is absolute, defined only by not completing the mission. Herein lies its advantage. Utter adaptability. By discarding the fictional rules of engagement and the enemy's codes of honor, the Astartes warrior instantly exploits any weakness presented. It is a philosophy perfectly and chillingly articulated by the sons of Horus Captain Garviel Loken. I kill until I'm told to stop. A weapon doesn't question who it kills or why. That isn't the point of weapons. A perfect philosophy for an instrument of conquest. But this doctrine, this unyielding virtue of blunt brutality, rests upon a single, terrible assumption, that the hand pointing the weapon will always remain true, and that the definition of threat will never be turned inward. But where some sought glory, and others the perfection of the kill, the fourth seat of the Mournival was occupied by an altogether different kind of warrior. Captain Garviel Loken, commander of the 10th Company. As this archival schematic attests, he was the Absolute Pragmatist. His arms were the legionary's standard tools, a combat blade and bolter. No artificer's flourish, no relic of a forgotten age. His fighting style was not of the dueling pits of terror, but of the gutter gangs of Chthoniya. Blunt force, street-brawling efficiency. He viewed battle not as a stage for heroism, but as a problem to be solved. This absence of ego was his defining trait. Loken explicitly rejected luck. He disdained glory, fighting strictly to secure the objective and survive, viewing combat entirely as a means to an end. He was, in many ways, the ideal Astartes that the Great Crusade was meant to produce, a logical, merciless instrument of compliance. And yet, in a galaxy where gods walk and ambition is a weapon, what happens to the pragmatist when logic fails? What becomes of the man who sees only the facts when the facts themselves become an impossible, soul-shattering heresy? And so, on the world designated murder against the cybernetic fury of the megarachnids, the Emperor's children were faced not with defeat, but with something far worse: humiliation. Their pursuit of a flawless war, a symphony of bolter fire and blade work, had brought them to the brink of utter annihilation, a failure of artistry that shamed them more than any loss of life. This near catastrophe exposes a fundamental schism in the philosophy of the Legiones Astartes, a schism we can deconstruct by the numbers: pride versus pragmatism. For legions like the Third, the core objective was never mere compliance. It was to prove supreme martial superiority. The enemy ceased to be a foe and became, in their eyes, an audience, a prop, or a sparring partner for their martial theater. The weapon of choice was not the most effective tool, but the most aesthetic one, the intricate, perfectly balanced relic sword. And the ultimate failure condition was not the loss of a world, but the shame of looking foolish, imperfect, or ungraceful. In contrast stood the cold calculus of pragmatism, the doctrine of Horus and his Luna wolves. Here, the objective was simply to neutralize the immediate threat. The enemy was an obstacle to be removed instantly. The weapon was whatever works, be it bolter, blade, or bare hands. The only failure that mattered was failing the overall mission. It was this ruthless efficiency that won Horus his title. But agents of ruin, like the chaplain Erebus, understood this dichotomy. They saw that pride was a vulnerability a pragmatist could not comprehend. When the anatheme, a foul blade of the long-dead Kinnebrock, was stolen from the archives of the Interrex on Zenobia Principus, it was chosen not for its pragmatism, but for its dark narrative potential. For a weapon is more than its physical form. A blade can be a tool to remove an obstacle, but it can also be a prop in a tragedy. And one must ask, when Erebus secured the anatheme, was its intended target the body of the pragmatist, Horus, or the pride of the man who believed himself invincible? The sour taste of the compliance of planet murder lingered in the recycled air of the 63rd Expeditionary Fleet. Trust had been broken, an alliance with the nascent human empire of the Interrex shattered by theft and murder. In the wake of this betrayal, a new and more insidious tension began to fester, not between human cultures, but between the legions themselves. It was in this atmosphere of simmering resentment that Captain Lucius of the Emperor's Children, his arrogance a match for his legendary skill, demanded an audience. Upon the cavernous training decks of the flagship Vengeful Spirit, a crucible was formed. As this tactical display shows, this was no mere sparring match. It was to be the ultimate exhibition of skill. The stakes were declared openly. Lucius sought to prove the absolute physical and philosophical superiority of his 3 legion. 2 bouts were staged to settle this debate. Watching from the perimeter were figures who represented the very soul of the fleet: the Mournival's choleric first captain Abaddon, and the ever-affable Torgadon. With them stood Captain Saul Tarvitz of the Emperor's Children, a warrior whose loyalty was to a code Lucius had begun to forget. And there, a lone mortal observer, the remembrancer Kirill Cinderman, his chronicle capturing not a display of martial pride, but the widening cracks in the foundation of brotherhood. And so, under the cold, artificial lights, ceramite clashed and blades sang to settle a matter of ego. But this exhibition was a distraction, a gaudy spectacle masking a far more subtle and venomous contest. While warriors debated philosophy with their swords, the true weapon that would decide the fate of the galaxy was being quietly unsheathed elsewhere in the fleet. And so it was, in the humming silence of the gladiator pits aboard the Vengeful Spirit, that the first true bout of the coming civil war was fought. Not with fleets or armies, but with 2 blades and the weight of 2 legacies. On one side stood Lucius of the Emperor's Children, a master swordsman whose vanity was matched only by his sublime skill. His opponent, first Chaplain Erebus of the Word-Bearers, a warrior whose piety masked a serpent's cunning. The duel was a spectacle of impossible celerity, a storm of steel we have since analysed through slowed pict capture. For 16 minutes their blades met in a constant screaming fury. Our chronometers confirm an average of 4 blows per second, a dizzying blur of strikes, parries, and ripostes, too fast for the unaugmented eye to truly follow. Then, the climax. At exactly the 59th second of the 16th minute, Lucius executed a perfect maneuver, hooking Erebus's guard, disarming him with contemptuous ease, and placing the cold steel of his blade against the chaplain's throat. He stood victorious, without suffering so much as a single scratch. The execution was flawless, the victory absolute, a testament to the perfection the 3rd Legion so desperately craved. Yet, as the defeated Erebus smiled, a question hangs in the historical record. When one duels a creature like Erebus, is the man with the sword at his throat truly the one who has lost? The hubris of the 3rd Legion was a palpable force, a perfumed arrogance that followed its sons like a shroud. For Lucius, it manifested as a sweaty, immediate demand, an utter contempt for the warrior before him. He fixed his gaze upon Captain Garviel Loken of the Lunar Wolves. "Show me how a Lunar Wolf fights, Loken," Lucius commanded, his voice dripping with condescension. "Show me how you win." Here was the core of the Emperor's Children philosophy. Combat as a performance, victory as an art form. Loken, by contrast, embodied the pragmatic lethality of the 16th. Our records describe him as reluctant, sighing as he armed himself with a simple, unadorned combat blade. His warning was not a plea, but a statement of fact. "I'm no swordsman. If we spar, it won't be just about the blade." It was an admonition entirely lost on the preening duelist. Lucius ignored the warning, waving it away with a single damning phrase. "Whatever, just get on and fight me." He sought a display of swordsmanship, a duel of honor. What he had, in fact, invited was a lesson in total warfare, a microcosm of the Lunar Wolf doctrine where the only rule is victory, and the method is irrelevant. Here lies the crux of the tragedy, the fulcrum upon which the entire conflict turned. It was not a matter of strength, nor of speed, but of perception, of cognitive geometry. As the archival pict log demonstrates, this was the fatal miscalculation. On one side, we see the mind of Lucius, represented by the intricate, almost beautiful complexity of dueling theory. He enters the cage, expecting a continuation of their first encounter, what the text calls Bout 1. He anticipates a contest of parries, ripostes, and blade work, the unspoken rules of a sophisticated fencing match. He expects a game. On the other side is the mind of Garviel Loken, stripped of all such artifice. It is a single, brutal vector, a red arrow denoting a simple, violent purpose. As Lucius prepared for the art, Loken prepared for the ending. He did not expect a game. He expected to end the fight. An elegant, self-serving equation of glorious combat versus a blunt instrument of finality. In the dawning age of total war, it remained to be seen which philosophy would prove more effective, and which was simply a prelude to slaughter. For the 3rd Legion, the Emperor's Children, combat was an art form. Every parry was a brushstroke, every riposte a line of poetry. To their champions, like Lucius, victory was secondary to the perfection of the duel itself. It was a philosophy of excess, an obsession with form that one captain of the Luna Wolves found to be a fatal weakness. On the training decks of the Vengeful Spirit, this clash of martial doctrine was made manifest. Our archives reduced the incident to a cold, tactical summary, its headline a grim thesis. Function violently overrides form. The sequence is brutally simple. 1. Lucius lunges, his blade a silver blur, expecting a duel of equals. 2. In response, Captain Garviel Loken drops his own sword entirely, a stunning repudiation of the expected rules. 3. Loken steps inside the swordsman's guard and drives a bare ceramite fist into Lucius's face. 4. Lucius hits the floor, spitting blood, his perfect form shattered by blunt, pragmatic force. The lesson was as stark as the words that defined it. Lunge, sidestep, punch. As Loken stood over his defeated opponent, his declaration echoed the entire philosophy of his legion. I think I made my point. That's how a Luna Wolf fights. This was more than a brawl in a training cage. It was a demonstration of a widening philosophical chasm between brother legions. The preference for brutal function over elegant form was a core tenet of the Luna Wolves, a trait their Warmaster valued above all others. But such pragmatism, stripped of honor and ritual, can become a vulnerability of its own, a path easily guided towards a victory that serves a much darker purpose. It was over in 3 seconds. A lifetime of study, of perfection in the blade, rendered utterly meaningless by a single, unorthodox choice. Here, we dissect the anatomy of that defeat, a confrontation not of steel, but of perception. Observe Vector 1, Lucius, the consummate duelist, executing a flawless arcing strike. His mind, a bioluminary of combat calculation, was wholly absorbed in processing the sword telemetry of the engagement. He anticipated a parry, a block, a counter-riposte. What he experienced instead was cognitive dissonance on a catastrophic scale. For Garviel Loken, in a moment of terrible clarity, became the rule breaker. By discarding his own weapon, Loken didn't just alter his tactics, he shattered the invisible laws of the duel upon which Lucius's entire fighting style was predicated. The framework of comprehension in Lucius's mind simply collapsed. This opened Vector 2, Loken's brutal, unarmed lunge, a straight line of violence that bypassed the ornate curve of the blade, striking directly at the warrior's center of mass, which was, as the diagram attests, completely exposed. Loken had not attacked the body. He had attacked the mind, and the body followed into ruin. This act, this breaking of the rules, was more than a simple battlefield expedient. It was a symptom of the new age dawning, an age where honor was a liability and perfection a fatal vulnerability. The duel was not merely between two captains. It was a microcosm of the war to come, where the very sanity of the Imperium's foundational tenets would be put to the sword. And one must ask, in the grim calculus of betrayal, who first taught the sons of Horus that the most effective weapon is a broken oath? Examine the lethal danger of martial hubris, captured in this simple doctrinal pyramid. For Captain Garviel Loken, his operating space was the foundation of all conflict, the unyielding bedrock of pragmatism. Survive the threat. From this, all victory could be built. For Lucius of the Emperor's Children, this foundation was not a concern. It was assumed, ignored. His operating space existed in a rarefied stratosphere of ego, a gilded capstone labeled, "Look perfect doing it." Every duel, every battle, was a performance to be perfected. The sparring match became a microcosm of a much darker tragedy, For the 3rd Legion had become so obsessed with the idea of perfection that they forgot the brutal reality of war. They mistook the stage for the battlefield, and applause for victory. A rigid, arrogant mind, as the record states, breaks easily when the rules of the universe change. And for a legion that believed it had mastered every rule of combat, the true horror was discovering that the universe had rules they could not possibly imagine. We arrive, at last, at the end. Look upon this final slide not as a lesson, but as an epitaph. The reality of the battlefield. Here is the discarded blade, its work done. Here is the silhouette, walking away from the consequence, or perhaps into it. Here the record is stamped, terminated. For what has truly ended is not a simple recording, but an entire age of reason. The text reads, "True martial mastery is not about looking flawless. It is about doing whatever is necessary to bring him down." This is the serpent's whisper that ended paradise. Consider the Interrex, a sophisticated human civilization coexisting with the Xenos Kinabrak. They could have been allies, but the priest Erebus, understanding his foe, Horus, better than the Warmaster understood himself, did what was necessary. He stole the Kinabrak dagger, the anatheme, from the Interrex Museum on Zenobia Principus, framing them and provoking a war of annihilation. It was an act devoid of style but full of purpose. This philosophy, learned in the brutal campaigns against foes like the Megarachnids, was twisted into the ultimate weapon. For the anatheme, in the hands of a traitor, would not bring down a mere Xenos, but the Warmaster Horus himself, gut-stabbed not in honourable combat, but in a contrived trap. This was not mastery, it was corruption. And so we see the final, terrible truth. The principle of doing what is necessary is the foundation upon which all heresies are built. The knife is dropped, the betrayer walks free, and the galaxy burns in his wake. In the grim dark of this reality, there are no points for style, it is true. There are also no points for honour, for mercy, or for hope. There is only the act, and the endless, echoing consequences. Here ends Pict Thule Archival Record 77 Delta. May the Emperor forgive our quest for knowledge, for the truth offers no comfort at all. Record terminated.